That night Bob Dylan walked onto the stage and everything was normal until he saw the photograph. Dylan lowered his guitar slowly, stepped back from the microphone, and said nothing for 40 seconds. The Orpheum Theater, Minneapolis, November 1997. A small venue by Dylan's standards, 200 seats, maybe 250 if you counted the standing room and back. The kind of intimate space he'd been choosing more often lately, turning away from the arenas and stadiums that had defined the previous decades. The stage was simple. A single microphone stand. 2 overhead lights casting warm pools of amber. Dylan's acoustic guitar. A harmonica rack. Nothing else. No band. No elaborate production. Just a man and his songs and the silence between them. Dylan had walked out at 8:47 p.m. without introduction. No announcer. No fanfare. He'd simply appeared from the wings, guitar already strapped across his shoulder, and moved to the microphone with that familiar shuffle, neither hurried nor slow, just the gait of someone who'd walked onto 10,000 stages and knew exactly how much space he occupied in the world. The audience had applauded. Not wildly. Respectfully. The kind of applause reserved for icons who no longer need to prove anything. Dylan had started with, "The times they are a-changin'." An obvious choice, maybe? The song everyone expected. But he'd played it slower than the recorded version, his voice rougher, the tempo stretched until each line felt like a meditation rather than a declaration. Then, "Don't think twice, it's all right." Then, "Girl from the North Country." The third song had been "Tangled Up in Blue." Dylan's fingers moved across the guitar strings with practiced efficiency. Not flashy, never flashy, but precise. His voice carried through the theater with that characteristic rasp, decades of cigarettes and highways worn into every syllable. He was halfway through the second verse when he saw the man. Front row. 6 seats from the left aisle. An elderly man, maybe late 60s, wearing a worn canvas jacket over a faded flannel shirt. Gray hair thinning at the crown. Weathered face showing years of outdoor work, construction, maybe, or farming. Hands rough and calloused even from 20 feet away. The man was holding something. A photograph. Old by the look of it. The edges worn from handling. He'd raised it slowly, carefully, holding it at chest level where Dylan couldn't help but see it. Dylan's fingers stopped moving. The guitar fell silent. His hands lowered to his sides. 40 seconds of silence. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Confused whispers rippled through the rows. Someone coughed. Someone else shuffled their feet. But mostly there was just the sound of 200 people holding their breath, wondering what was happening, wondering if this was part of the performance, or if something had gone wrong. Dylan didn't move. He stood at the microphone, staring at the photograph being held up in the front row, his face completely unreadable, and yet somehow stripped of all the usual defenses. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. To understand what Dylan saw in that photograph, you need to understand what happened in 1966. Bob Dylan wasn't always Bob Dylan, weathered icon of American music. In 1966, he was 25 years old and drowning. Drowning in expectations. Drowning in fame. Drowning in the weight of being called the voice of a generation, when all he'd wanted was to write songs. He'd gone electric at Newport the year before. Half his audience had booed. The folk purists called him a traitor. The rock fans called him a sellout to folk. Everyone had an opinion about what Bob Dylan should be, what he should sound like, what he should stand for. He toured relentlessly. Europe. Australia. North America. Playing 2 shows some nights, acoustic first half, electric second half. Each performance a battlefield. Each crowd divided. Each city another reminder that he'd become something bigger than himself and couldn't figure out how to get small again. On July 29, 1966, Dylan was riding a Triumph motorcycle near his home in Woodstock, New York. He hit something, accounts vary, and Dylan himself has told different versions over the years. A patch of oil. A pothole. His own exhaustion. He crashed. The official story: broken vertebrae. Concussion. Months of recovery. But the real injury wasn't physical. The real injury was that the crash gave him permission to stop. He disappeared. Cancelled tours. Turned down interviews. Stopped releasing albums for 18 months. The world thought he was recuperating. What he was really doing was remembering how to be human instead of a symbol. During those months in Woodstock, Dylan mostly stayed home. He played with his children. He read books. He sat on his porch and watched the seasons change. And occasionally, very occasionally, he'd pick up a guitar and play. Not for audiences, not for records, just to remember what it felt like to make music for its own sake. There was a kid who lived down the road. David Brenner. 15 years old. Father worked construction. Mother had died 2 years earlier. The kid was quiet, kept to himself, spent most of his time walking the woods around Woodstock with a camera his mother had given him before she passed. David knew Bob Dylan lived nearby. Everyone in town knew, but he never approached him. Never asked for an autograph. Never tried to talk to him. He'd just occasionally see Dylan sitting on his porch, and he'd nod, and Dylan would nod back, and that was the extent of their interaction. Until one afternoon in October 1966. David was walking past Dylan's property with his camera when he heard guitar music drifting through the trees. Not a recording. Live playing. Slow and quiet, like someone working through a melody for the first time. David stopped. He knew he should keep walking. This was private property. Private music. But something about the melody held him. He stood at the edge of the property line, not trespassing, just listening. Dylan was on his porch, guitar in lap, playing something David had never heard before. A song about time and loss and rivers that keep flowing no matter what. The lyrics were incomplete, halting, repeated lines like Dylan was still figuring out what he wanted to say. Dylan stopped playing. Looked up. Saw David standing there. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Dylan said, "You like that?" David nodded, unable to speak. "Come here," Dylan said. Not a command. Just an invitation. David walked across the grass to the porch. Dylan gestured to the steps. David sat. "You're the kid with the camera," Dylan said. Statement, not question. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. Makes me feel old." Dylan played a few more chords. "What do you photograph?" "Trees, mostly." "The woods?" "Sometimes birds." "Why?" David thought about it. "Because they don't change. Everything else changes, but trees just stay." Dylan smiled slightly. Not his public smile, the one he used in interviews and performances. Something quieter. More real. "Everything changes, kid. Even trees. Just takes longer to notice." They sat there for maybe 20 minutes. Dylan played fragments of songs. David listened. Neither of them said much. When the sun started setting, David stood to leave. "Wait," Dylan said. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil from his shirt pocket, scribbled something, folded it. "If you ever need something. Someone to talk to. Whatever. You can find me." It was a phone number. Dylan's actual phone number. David stared at it. "Why?" Dylan shrugged. "You listened. That's rare. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding." David never called the number. He wanted to. There were nights after his father had too much to drink, and the house felt too small and too empty without his mother when he'd take out that piece of paper and look at it. But he never dialed. He did take a photograph that day, though. Before he left Dylan's porch, he'd asked if he could take one picture. Dylan had agreed. David had raised his mother's camera and captured Dylan sitting there on the porch steps, guitar across his lap, looking not like Bob Dylan the icon but like someone's neighbor who happened to play music. David kept that photograph. Through high school. Through Vietnam, where he was drafted in 1969. Through the jungle and the firefights and the friends who didn't come home. Through the decades that followed. Construction jobs like his father, a marriage that didn't last, children he didn't see enough, the slow accumulation of years and regrets. The photograph stayed with him, folded in his wallet. A reminder of the afternoon when Bob Dylan, voice of a generation, had invited a grieving kid to sit on his porch and just listen to music that wasn't for anyone but the moment. Dylan had eventually returned to touring. Returned to recording. Returned to being Bob Dylan. David had followed his career from a distance, buying albums, reading occasional articles, never attending concerts because he couldn't afford tickets and because somehow it felt wrong to see Dylan as a spectacle after having seen him as just a man on a porch. Until November 1997. Until David's daughter bought him tickets for his 68th birthday. Until he found himself sitting in the front row of the Orpheum Theater in Minneapolis with that old photograph in his pocket, thinking maybe, just maybe, Dylan would remember. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. On stage, Dylan stood motionless for another 10 seconds. Then he carefully lifted the guitar strap over his head and set the instrument down, leaning it against the mic stand with deliberate precision. He stepped off the stage. Not dramatically. Not quickly. Just walked to the edge of the platform and stepped down into the front row. The theater erupted in confused murmurs. The house lights stayed down. Nobody knew what was happening. Dylan walked to where David sat. Stood directly in front of him. David lowered the photograph, his hands trembling. Woodstock, Dylan said. Not a question. A recognition. David nodded, unable to speak. 1966, October. You were the kid with the camera. Yes, David managed. Dylan looked at the photograph David still held. May I? David handed it over. Dylan studied it for a long moment. That image of himself 3 decades younger, sitting on porch steps in Woodstock, guitar in lap, before he'd figured out how to be Bob Dylan again. When he'd just been someone trying to remember why music mattered. You never called, Dylan said quietly. I wanted to. I didn't think I should. Why not? Because you already gave me something. That afternoon. Sitting there. You didn't have to do that. And I didn't want to ask for more. Dylan handed the photograph back. But his hand went to his pocket. He pulled out a harmonica, the same one he'd been using during the performance. He held it out to David. Now we're even, Dylan said. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan returned to the stage. Picked up his guitar. Stood at the microphone. But he didn't continue. Tangled Up in Blue. Instead, he played something else. Something he almost never performed live. Not Dark Yet. From his 1997 album Time Out of Mind. A song about aging, about shadows growing long, about standing at the edge of something you can't quite name. He played it slower than the recorded version. His voice even rougher. Every line felt like confession. The audience sat in absolute silence. Not the silence of confusion anymore. The silence of witnessing something real. When the song ended, there was no applause. Just David in the front row, holding a harmonica, tears running down his weathered face. Dylan finished the concert. Played 6 more songs. Never mentioned what had happened. When he walked off stage at the end, he didn't come back for an encore. After the show, David stayed in his seat long after everyone else had left. A theater employee eventually approached him, said they needed to lock up. David stood. Started to leave. Then he saw it. On his seat. A piece of paper, folded once. His hands shaking, he opened it. It was a phone number. Dylan's actual phone number. Again. After 31 years. Below it, in Dylan's handwriting, you should have called the first time. But it's not too late. David left the theater holding the harmonica and the note. He walked 3 blocks before he found a payphone. His hands shook as he dialed the number. Dylan answered on the second ring. "Took you long enough," Dylan said. Not angry. Almost amused. They talked for 17 minutes. About Woodstock. About David's mother. About Vietnam and construction and the years that pile up when you're not paying attention. About music and photographs and why some moments stay with you. At the end, Dylan said, "That photograph. Keep it. But remember, it's not about 1966. It's about tonight. It's about calling." David called that number 6 more times over the next 2 years before Dylan changed it again. They never met in person after that night in Minneapolis. But they talked. About nothing important. About everything important. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. When David died in 2003, his daughter found the photograph and the harmonica in a box labeled "Things That Mattered." She also found the notes from those phone calls, dates, times, brief summaries of conversations between her father and Bob Dylan that nobody knew about. She wrote Dylan a letter. Thanked him. Never heard back. But 6 months later, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a signed copy of Time Out of Mind and a note in Dylan's handwriting. "Your father listened when most people don't. That's rare. That's why it mattered. The photograph is still in the family. The harmonica too. Reminders that Bob Dylan's greatest performances weren't always on stage.